Hello once again everyone, and welcome back to the Open Longsword playbook. It has been a while since I've gotten back to the series because I've been terribly distracted. And join me is Dave, who's going to be helping me out with our middle game. So, what is the middle game? We talked about the high game, we talked about the wide game, we talked about cuts and cut combos and stuff like that. Now it's all about point forward stuff. Now, specifically, point forward can either come about as people are thrusting because there's no point in wide thrusting, right? It's the idea of you're going straight up the center line. This can either be, again, someone's initially thrusting, or alternatively, you cut to bind and then all this stuff can happen. Now, this, especially given that the Open Longsword playbook is meant to mostly tackle synthetic and or lower gear level of sparring, we're not going to get too much into the weeds of some other things that if you're more experienced you may be familiar with, or alternatively if you've kind of read ahead by looking at some of the other sources. So, for the most part, this is going to be more exemplary than set things, but I will draw attention to what is like a set thing. So, our very first action, we're going to learn about straight thrust. A straight thrust or a free thrust is just that. It's when all I do is I see an opening, and from whatever position I'm in, the position we'll be using as our example here is going to be short point, all I do is I just extend and step, so that way the weight of my body drives the sword forward. There are many different free thrusts that you can do, but the important thing is that they don't need anything beyond them. A free thrust can even be done, from long point, just out go. It's just the arms are centralized and extended, and you push forward with your body to deliver the thrust. That's all we're dealing with at the moment. So for our first play, as it were, in your first example, is delivering a free thrust. Again, the simplest one. You put your non-dominant foot forward, and you stand in the guard of short point. We're going to go ahead and have Dave drop down the iron gate. Boom, there's an opening. I choose not to cut because I'm already point forward, so I'm just going to extend, step. That's all I worry about. And given we're going effectual roll set, I'm always targeting here into the well of the chest, right at the base of the throat. Don't want to be targeting down here, and don't actually want to be going up for the head. Especially when you're doing in lower gear, you may feel more inclined to go for the head, but I'll point out the head is a small target and not actually all that lined up. When I go to thrust at Dave's face, I have to lift my hands to hit that target. That's affecting my aim, versus if I extend straight, that's center to center. Very hard for me to miss, and a lot stronger. So, that's the very first part. Now in response to it, we're going to talk about parrying. Now the big danger when it comes to the middle game is we're trying to control the center line and not drive him off of it. Reason being is that Dave, I'm going to go ahead and do a thrust. I'd like you to give it a nice stout parry, okay? So, he gives me that target. There we go. I extend and step, he parries. If he pushes my sword well hard off the line, there's nothing stopping me from just continuing and cutting with that motion. And in fact, I'm almost forced to cut because I'm in the process of doing my thrust. If you're ready for this, it can be something that you can exploit, but for the most part, the biggest thing that happens when you're playing middle game at the beginning is someone will start to play middle, the other person will over parry, and that leads to a cut. Over and over and over again in every single plane you can possibly imagine. So instead, if you are going to parry against a thrust, the best thing to do is to be very gentle about it. Let's switch slides real quick. So what do I mean by gentle? The important thing to remember is that you can never stop a thrust. You can stop a cut, but a thrust is always going to continue. As such, when this thrust is coming in, so I'm going to go ahead and make the opening, and Dave's going to stand in short point. What I'm not trying to do is interrupt too much of it, because that's powering his cut. Instead, what I'm more looking to do is just kind of put something in the way. So, my sword is at him, meaning he can't thrust at me. I lower down the iron gate. As he goes to stab at me, I'm going to return to iron gate. Now, this by itself may actually be enough to defend me, because I'm putting myself in the middle line again. That's where he was going. However, to make myself a little bit safer, if I at the same time just step behind my sword, so I do a little triangle step, now there's no way he's going to hit me, but from his perspective, I didn't add any energy to where his thrust was going. It just terminates out into space that I was not occupying. This also has the added benefit of setting me up to do a riposte, but that's not the focus. So once again, not a hard parry, just a gentle one. We're both in short point. I lower, he goes to stab me. I raise and I step, giving him no lateral pressure, and now I am safe. Now, that can be applied in a bunch of different ways, but that's the main idea. If you gotta parry a thrust, just return back to the middle, put something in the way, and get yourself behind that shape, and you're safe. Now, The next part of this is how to get around that piece. So we've got attack, we've got defense, now it's compound attack, getting around it. So, what you do is it depends upon when someone bites on your free thrust. So, for example, we're both standing in short point. Dave gives me that opening. You notice that with our thrust we have 2 tempo here, right? Very small, but 2 actions. I have my arms coming out, locking into place, and then I have my foot going forward, delivering the attack. Dave may bite on either one of these 2 tempo. It can depend upon the person, it can depend upon the moment. Regardless though, I'm not, even when I start stepping, I'm not fully committed the whole time. If he tries to bring his sword back to middle because of the distance I'm launching this at, I have plenty of time to see what's happening, and I can now do a disengage. This works very well against slight parries. It works even better against wide parries, but the idea is, when he lowers himself down, I extend and start to step. I'm going to just dip, which brings me right back to the center of target. In that case, I got stuck on his glove, but again, that's still the central line of target, and my thrust will land at the same tempo it was going to originally. So here's that again. We're both in short point. He gives me an opening. I extend, start to step. I dip, I land. Now, you'll notice that his tip is by my face at the moment. That's because, again, this is an exemplary. Everything we're going over, those are just the key pieces for the middle game. We're going to talk about applying them in different places in a minute. If you want to make yourself safe, though, you always keep your true edge to your opponent. So, we're currently true edge to true edge on the inside. He gives an opening. I go extend and step. I disengage. I turn my edge the other way, and now I am safe. I can even let my feet turn if I wish to, which just adds more protection. But the biggest thing is, when you're learning this, is don't really overcomplicate things at first. Yes, his sword being there is absolutely a consideration, but he's in the process of listening to me. I need to keep my thrust going rather than giving him room to come back at me and change the fight. In time, once you're comfortable with that timing, then you can start locking things down, and then next thing you know, it's second nature. So, those are our 3 pieces, technically 4. You have what a free thrust is, you have his gentle parry in response to it, you have a disengage to get around the parry, or if he does a hard parry, that usually turns into a cut, but could also be a disengage. The next part we need to talk about is, okay, it seems like the thrust is near unbeatable, how do you deal with it? And this is where we talk about counter thrust. Let's switch slides again, Dave. So counter thrust. This is the preferred response, and in general, for most, as you move out of Open Longsword into other things, there's going to be that emphasis on counterattacking is just better by default as opposed to defending, because you are retaking initiative as you go. In regards to thrust, it is absolutely the best thing because, once again, you can't stop a thrust. So the best mentality to think about here when it comes to counter thrusting is I am not defending then offending. I'm not even really paying attention to his motion. As he starts to attack toward me, I am going to attack back against him, and it is his moving forward that delivers him onto the point. The last neuron that fires in his brain is going, I just did great, and then he gets stabbed. Now, the simple, kind of hierarchy of it is that if Dave is doing a free thrust, a straight thrust, again, free thrust is just thrusting in the opening, straight thrust is specifically when it's just in front of you and you're using your body. By default, go ahead and extend and step. He does not have a lot of pressure in the lateral plane. There's a lot of force going straight up the middle, but anything can knock this aside. This is what leads to the cuts happening more often than not. So, to make my counter thrust more powerful, what I'm going to do is I'm going to open my hands and kind of start dipping into wide game idea. So, I go from short point, which gives me no opening, to instead of dropping my sword down, I'm going to turn over into our next guard, which is plowing. Now, this is just, again, to illustrate, my hands are to the 45, my tip is still pointed at what I'm looking at, but because I moved it offline, it doesn't look like it is. This will allow me, when I drive with both of my hands, to get the power of lateral pressure, because I'm essentially thrusting on a 45-degree angle, inward, which I just showed will defeat his straight thrust. So, we're going to put ourselves there very slowly at first. We're both in short point, and this is your next exercise. One step forward. There we go. I open. He extends and starts to step. I close. So it's just you go right back to where you were, now extending the hands as he is stepping forward. You will glide against his centralized thrust, but you have the power to beat what he puts forward. That's how you stab them back. Now, very much at first, you don't really need to step in its most ideal situation. And a lot of counter thrusts usually don't, right? We're here against each other. I open, he goes for it. He brought himself to me. The only thing I may need to use my foot for is if I do need to step, my step is doing the same as our gentle parry. It's bringing me just behind my weapon out to the side, rather than forward where my arms will either have to compress or I have to make him compress, which is really not necessary. He's stabbing himself with this. So, one more time with that whole drill. Short point on short point, open to plow, he goes for the thrust, close off the plow, and if need be, step a little bit. And that's your counter thrust in its most simplest form. We use a mechanical advantage to beat him going up the middle line after providing an opening. No problem. So, those are all our pieces. Now what we need to do is we need to take those pieces and we're going to put them in a different situation. So, what happens if someone is counter thrusting you, right? Basically, well, let me rewind on that. What happens if instead of a free thrust, he is also doing a thrust that has this sort of lateral pressure? Then we need to use our feet a little bit more. So, we're both standing in short point, but now when I open to plow, so does he. Now this means that he's still doing a thrust into my opening, but when he pushes into that middle and steps, go ahead, that has a lot more lateral pressure behind it. Sure, can I still just nail this counter thrust? Absolutely. But with his hips becoming a lot more involved with this push, not necessarily a guarantee I'll win, all the time. As such, my mechanic is still going to be the same, but now my feet are going to go forward to get rid of his steps. So we'll do this very slowly. I open, he opens, he starts thrusting, I start thrusting, but now my step is taking me onto the line that his sword traveled. This ensures that his strength, by the time it reaches me, and by the time it would interact with my sword, we're lined up again, and this ends up exactly the same as the one we did before. So, simple as can be. Straight thrust, provokes a parry, disengage, kills it. Against a straight thrust, using a couch thrust or a turning thrust, counter thrust it. Against a turning or couch thrust, you must use more of your legs to get around it. And those are all the simple pieces. So, now, let's take that and move it up into the high line. So, we're both standing, once again, in short point, but now we're going to change things. If, for whatever reason, you want to do a free thrust at the high line, you can, of course, just bring your hands up into one of your oxes. In general, the ox that you're going to find most people thrust freely out of is going to be standing here in their left side, or non-dominant side. And the simple reason of that, go ahead and load your sword, Dave. The simple reason behind that is that from this, I can reach really far while still defending my head, or at worst, I can turn my hands down to guard against his most dominant side. You can do the same thing from here, but it's just a little bit shorter because your hands are crossed. So most times you'll see free thrusts on the high line are going to be people who are up here, and they just plant that point nice and quick. So, can everything we worked on the low line work again here? Yes, it can. We're both standing against each other, but this time I'll go ahead and go up into ox on my left. Dave can be in whatever position, but we'll go ahead and match for sake of. I see a free target on the side of his head, so I go to extend and step forward with my lead foot. He goes to parry. I dip underneath. There's my strike with the disengage. No big deal. Now, alternatively, we're here once again. I go to extend and step, and Dave gives me a hard parry of some sort. So he powered my cut, same as before. Now, conversely, Dave is now the one who's going to do the free thrust against me. Here's where things get a little tricky. If I am also standing on the same side as him on the high line, as a right-hander against another right-hander, while I can counter thrust from my left against him, it's not going to be very good. Instead, what more often you want to do is if you know someone's going to play up here and thrust on this side, you want to try and get yourself over into your right ox. And the reason for that is, again, he's still doing a straight thrust, so extend and step. Not passing step, extend and step. There we go. Which means he has no lateral pressure. Now, as a reason for why I'm not having him do the passing step as well, let's rewind one. If he does extend and step with his back foot, that just gets stupid easy because his hips go away. This is why most people prefer when they plant that free thrust to stay lined up a la a lunge. Anyway, back up again. He has no lateral pressure. So if I'm over on my right side when he extends and steps, it's not very hard for me to achieve this counter thrust. Now I got what is known as cross guard lock. I've talked about this before, but the simple idea is I was extending down to middle, so I am safe, he is not, everything is great. Didn't even really need to use my feet. So one more, let's switch sides on that and I'll show it again. He is up in ox, one slight step back. There we go. I am over in right ox. He goes to extend and step. I counter thrust, which sometimes you'll end up with this, where you end up a little more on the head. Again, there's that cross guard lock. Not a problem. He's unable to cut. I am perfectly able to re-aim that thrust and point, or do whatever I need to do. If I do feel the need to step, I just step behind that shape once again. It's all the same lesson. Only thing that might change on this side is if your range is great enough, you may need to turn all the way over into your left ox to get your thrusts. So real slowly, so we can guarantee it happens, because synthetics are an interesting medium. He extends and steps, and I counter thrust, and I get to about here. Now we're far enough away, I'm not going to get cross guard lock. To get my point down on the target, since it's too high, I'm going to keep turning and step, allowing me to plunge over into the next opening. It's the exact same idea as what my counter thrust would have been anyway. It's just, as I align, I go in from the top. But really, it's the same piece. So, where does this leave our middle game? It's all pretty much the same couple pieces over and over and over again. You see the opportunity for a free thrust, you plant it. If someone tries to parry that, hard or soft, you disengage preferably, so you get to use the faster thrust. If you see a thrust coming toward you, you counter thrust it. If you see a thrust coming toward you with some lateral power, use your legs along with your counter thrust. In fact, let's show that on the high line real quick. So, Dave is also up in right ox. So he is standing left foot forward with the sword across. If I see this, yep, up we go. If I see this, the counter thrust still works exactly the same. He extends and steps down the middle. And this time he's using that lateral pressure, but his hands will have to turn down before they can turn all the way back up. And even if they do, it's the same opening we just talked about. So rewind. All I do in response to this is as he thrusts, so too do I end up winning. I just use a little bit more of my legs. Now, the final piece is, okay, great, this all makes sense. How do I get out of the point forward game if I need to, or rather, how do I get into it? Because generally speaking, while this situation can occur, and this is your example of all the things, the hardest part is just getting into it, especially when you're playing in a world where most people like to just cut at you. So, here are my two suggestions for getting into it. Suggestion number one, we are going to catch their cut. So for this, Dave is up on either above his head or at his shoulder, doesn't matter. He's in a cutting guard, okay? I am going to give him invitation by moving down into one of my iron gates as we did before, and as he goes to cut at me, I'm going to let him cut all the way out. I want to catch Dave into extension, because the second he's in extension, he's vulnerable to all this tip stuff we just talked about. So I'm not going out to catch him. I'm letting him come practically onto my head. As this happens, go ahead and have you rewind. What I'm going to do is I'm going to make a cover, like we did before when we went over the high game. I'm just going to step over and go into a tight little ox. Now notice this is a tight ox, not an extended ox. If I catch him out there, if I didn't stab him in the face in that moment, we will end up in the cutting game again. But if I let him extend and catch it here, where it would have hit my head, I'll end up lined up against him, as I will now show. So he's ready to cut. I give him an invitation. He cuts. I catch, moving to the side, which now he's nice and extended, meaning I have a lot more leverage than he does. My tip is at his face, and I'm just one extension away from being able to put it up his face if need be. If he tries to cut around at me or anything along those lines from here, which is in general not a great idea, for the most part, once you're here, people are going to do one of two things. Either they'll try and shorten their blade back to your point, so they'll pull their hands back. Yeah, well, that's not going to save you. Pull your hands back, keep your tip up. There we go. Back, so I don't stab him. Because again, let's bring his sword back out there. If he leaves his sword on my weak, it's going into his chest. If he pulls the sword back to deal with the tip, hey, we've been here before, it's just the disengaged stuff again. If he pulls it back really hard and pushes, that's cut territory. Generally speaking though, most people who have a decent amount of experience are going to make it short rather than hard pushing. If they do hard push, you won't even think about that cut. The other thing they will do, which is far rarer, but may come up, is instead of trying to play the point game, they'll ignore you and just try to cut around a second time. Not a big deal in the slightest. He's ready to cut, so I open, I catch his cut, he tries to cut around at my upper opening again. I do the same catch, we're just in the other side now, and everything plays out exactly the same as it did on the first side. So that's one option. And you can do this in any plane you can think of. Your strongest guards for doing this are going into plow on either side. Generally speaking, though, you want to catch in either left ox or left plow. That's where you're going to be strongest entering into the point game. The second option that you have is to do a counter cut. Now, this one's a little bit trickier, but it's kind of the first real example of that simultaneous counteraction with a cut that we're going to see in this playbook. So, if I'm not ready to catch in a point forward guard, maybe I was already in a cutting guard and I decide, Dave is weak to point forward game, I'd like to stab Dave, I kind of usually want to stab Dave. So, we'll go ahead and get into the point game. What I'm going to do is when he cuts at me, I could still make the cover, so he cuts. I can move over into this and we talked about like we just did, but that's a little bit riskier. So instead, I'm going to cut down into long point immediately. Now, this can turn into you hit them instantaneously, but that's not necessarily our goal. What I'm more focused on is I want to go from here to here, maintaining about this distance, so that Dave's cut once again extends all the way out, giving me the leverage to put him into obedience with the point forward game. So here's that again. I give him that opportunity, he cuts at me. I go into point forward game. Now because he managed to get his cut all the way out, it didn't stop, I countercut. He gets the same options we just talked about. I can either just stab him, or he can try and pull his blade back to get that point out of his face, disengage stab him, or he can pull his blade back and push my hands off to the side. There's the free cut, or he can try and cut around at me. Hey, we're here again. And it's just the same cyclical thing over and over and over again. So those are my suggestions for how to get into the point game. You get them into an extended place, either they put themselves there or you make them go there with those examples, and then you just end up with the same couple pieces over and over again. Certainly speaking, if you are someone on the receiving end of that, if they are just thrusting freely at you, you counter thrust. If you find yourself stuck in the point forward game and you want to get out of it, either gentle parry to get yourself some space, or alternatively, if you can move into a guard that allows you to counter thrust, then that's your answer. And the final thing is, how do you get out of it? Okay? Maybe I don't want to play the point forward game, but I entered into it. I've done my objective. The biggest thing to look for is that thrust, once again, never stop. So at any point during these, we'll use the first one as an example, right? I give Dave opening, he cuts down at me. Cut, my friend. He cuts down at me. I catch, and for whatever reason, I don't want to stay in this point game. I still thrust at him to get him to defend, but regardless of how he defends when I come at him, I just use that thrust terminating past him to power my next cut. And this is usually what you're going to encounter most people doing with their early point work, is they'll fire thrusts, set up well or not, get you to parry, gentle or not, and use that momentum to then lead into the cut. And this can be done in a bunch of different ways. The easiest way to learn it, let's switch sides one more time for the final bit, and this would be your final drill for the point forward game, is just take a nice long extended thrust from whatever guards you want, right? Against whatever guards you want, doesn't really matter. I fire my thrust nice and strong from a good distance away, and the second he parries it, I will cut him. Let's see that parry. I'm going to plant it. Over and over and over again. The biggest thing you need to look out for is, of course, your momentum's going to keep going forward. So make sure that you're not ending up overrunning them. This cut, this final cut, is a wrist cut. So once he parries, I am not going to lift this up and add shoulder to it. One, because I don't need to, and two, because it makes me exposed. The sword just stays where it is, pivots around the wrists, and there's your answer. Over and over again in every plane you can think of. So one more time on that. I fire my thrust. As he parries, I deliver my cut, making myself nice and safe. That's how you get out of the point forward game. So, thank you very, very much, Dave. And thank you all very much for watching. A long video, I know, but that's the overall introduction to it. Mostly it's exemplary, and then this can either come up or not. It kind of varies. The biggest thing when it comes to playing around in this rule set is just keep it simple. If you see the opportunity, don't omit the thrust in favor of a cut. Generally speaking, there are a lot of good times to plant a thrust in place of a cut because it's faster, but make sure you can aim. Otherwise, though, thank you very much for watching. We'll go over some other techniques another time.